here to do a little color mixing with you, and we'll see how we can get some oranges mixed up. So I've got alizarin crimson, cadmium yellow in 2 different quantities here, and the same with the cadmium red and the cadmium yellow in 2 different quantities. So we're mixing up some oranges. I'm going to take this mixture first here. And again, with the orange and blue mixtures, the orange and blue palette that we're starting off with, you are going to follow along the same guidelines that you did for the red and green, which is basically you're going to mix up a variety of oranges, and you're going to have your primary blues, and then you're going to be intermixing between those. So you're seeing the full range of the blue and orange palette that's available to you. And you'll notice the different qualities of the different types of oranges that you can make with these colors. And I'm just mixing up one kind of orange with the alizarin crimson and cadmium yellow. This one here is going to be a lighter, more yellow orange between the two. And remember again, as you're mixing, if you're going to be mixing these colors, that you mix enough of them and that you're not shy with your quantity, because you're going to be using these in your painting. So go ahead and get a good mix up and go forward. We've talked a little bit about warm and cool, and how different paints have different qualities, different pigments have different qualities that we read as warm and as cool. And this alizarin crimson that I'm mixing up tends to be read as the cooler / bluer, more violet version of the 2 reds that you have. And so as you're mixing up your oranges, even though orange is the warmest color on the palette, this orange is going to be a cooler orange. So it's always relative, right, to the other. And so I've got now a cooler red orange over in this corner, and I've got a yellow orange, and then I've got sort of a middle orange mixed with alizarin crimson and yellow. And remember to just keep wiping off your palette knife. Go through so many paper towels. So I've got these as well. I'm going to mix a red orange with the cadmium red and yellow. So you're going to get a very different kind of red orange than your alizarin orange. And you're noticing that the bluishness in that one casts it toward a much more muted type of orange, and this red orange is quite brilliant, very warm. And so we'll leave that, and we'll go toward a middle orange here. You can do this however makes sense to you. I'm not always the most logical about the way that I put down paint or consistent, but the main thing is to make sure that it makes sense to you, that you know you're getting a red orange, a middle orange, and a yellow orange in decent quantity on your palette before you start this project. And that again, you're familiarizing yourself with how we perceive our particular palette of color, and still getting used to these paints, right? So that's a beautiful middle orange. Might even be slightly more toward I might add just a little bit more red to that if I'm thinking of that as a middle orange, because it still has a a bit more, had more of the yellow coming through. Okay. Do place this on higher speed to watch. Okay. And you'll notice when you wipe from the back, you're going to get a little bit more of that on there. So, okay, I'm going to make my yellow orange here. So I'm just adding a little bit of the orange next to it. And you do want to make sure you have a nice vibrant yellow orange to work with in this palette. And really, when you look at this yellow orange, this yellow orange here is really what a cadmium yellow medium would look like out of a tube if you bought it. So it's really also just would be reading as a yellow, just so that you know that if you're buying paint, that would be the difference between a cadmium yellow and a cadmium yellow medium. So I might even add just a little bit more of my middle orange, so it doesn't take it too much toward just straight old yellow. We want to try and stay true to that. We're dealing with a blue-orange palette, limited, to see how we work with that. Okay. I'm mixing today in daylight on a cloudy day, just so that my paints don't dry out as much as they did last time when I was mixing under the light. Also to save electricity, and so we'll notice the difference there. So you've got your 3 different oranges built from your alizarin crimson, and you've got your 2 blues. So we were talking about warm and cool, and we have ultramarine blue here, and we've noticed already that it is a beautiful transparent color as well as an opaque color. This is how it looks in its transparent form, and the ultramarine blue in its opaque form has a very dark, rich color. And then we have our cerulean blue, and that is a lighter blue to begin with. Its value is lighter. We've learned from the value scale the different values of the colors, and it has a slightly greener tinge to it, which means it heads slightly more toward the warmer element. So we talked about warm and cool reds, and that the alizarin crimson has a cooler feel to it, more toward the blue, and the cadmium is warmer. And the same here, we could view this ultramarine blue as warmer, as cooler, and the cerulean blue as warmer because it heads more toward the yellow. I have read actual long articles debating this and people feeling that ultramarine blue is a warm color. And I think that has to do with if you're relating it to a cooler type of blue, of which there are many. But on our palette, we don't have a cooler blue. We have a cooler green in the Viridian. So what I'm also going to do here, just to remind me and you, that we have this beautiful middle mixture between the 2 blues. And so rather than always feeling like you have to choose between the warmer or the cooler or the darker or the lighter, if you mix this middle blue, you're getting sort of a third mixture of primary. So there's no desaturation here. It's just a primary color that's emulating a sort of a cobalt blue, which is a blue that you also buy out of the tube, a different type of pigment. So, and you could do variations in between if you wanted to do that. I'm going to talk a little bit about how white affects these colors, and since we're dealing with warm and cool. So I'll go ahead and take each color and mix a bit of white with them, and also just so then you can kind of feel how how each color is tinted. So again, remember when you add white to a color, you are tinting it and you also are desaturating it. So you're taking some of the saturation out of that color, and that's desaturation. When you're bringing another element into the color that takes some of that color away, that it desaturates it and shifts it. So right here, you're noticing in the white form of each color, perhaps a different way of seeing that warmth and coolness. One thing that you may notice, if you're attuned to this sense of warm and cool, is that the white is cooling off an already cool color. So this color, though it made it lighter indeed, it also, by adding white, is making it a slight bit cooler. So that's important to notice when you're using white. White can do amazing things for a color, but often when we add white to a color, we need to ask what it has done to the quality of that color. And if it's cooled it off a lot, which it does, sometimes that's exactly what you wanted, to make it cooler and lighter, done. But oftentimes you might want to add another element to that color. And oftentimes it is a warming element. And that's a whole other discussion, and we will discuss it. But I will say that oftentimes you will want to re-warm a color. In this case, to do that, you would be adding a little bit of a complement potentially, because we're dealing with this limited palette. If you were dealing with a full palette, you might just go for the next warmest color up. So the next warmest color to blue is green, and that's a more subtle shift of that. So we'll do the same for a couple of these. I'm not going to do each one, but I'll take a very warm color, which is your yellow orange, and add white to it. And you'll see how the fieriness and the brilliance of that yellow orange is lost when we add white to it. So when you're trying to make an orange lighter, know that you are also losing brilliance. And brilliance is something that we've talked a tiny bit about when we were talking about the value of color, but it makes a color pop forward. And yellow really does that, red really does that, certain blues really do that. And desaturating the pure chroma from that color really takes the brilliance out of that. And so that might be disappointing when you're trying to make a color lighter, but not necessarily less brilliant. How do you do that, you know? So oftentimes it means that you would add more yellow to that to make it lighter and try and work it that way. So again, you can really see how white changes a warm color so much. So this is a more subtle shift from cool to cooler, and this is really a very dramatic difference in the identity of the color. So we're getting these kind of peachy oranges, which exist in nature, and sometimes you want to make these colors, or sometimes they're the beginning of another complex type of color. And here we are making what really appears to be a pink, because it's such a red orange that we've made. It really has just a little bit of yellow in it. So we can see what our range is there. All right. And in some ways, that red orange might, you know, kind of trip up the warm, cool red orange thing, and maybe I would add yellow to both of those. But it is truly a red orange, and so it belongs in the palette. I'm not going to add the white to these at this moment because I think you're getting the point of how these are working. And I want to get on to desaturating a couple of these paints and to see that you're understanding how these colors change each other, because we know when blue and orange are next to each other, they have a particular relationship of making each other more intense and more vibrant when they're next to each other. And just like with the red and the green, when they're mixed together, they change into a whole other kind of hue, and they're desaturating each other. All right, so in this case, as we're mixing the ultramarine blue, cerulean blue mixture together with a middle orange that is heading more toward yellow, we're seeing that we're getting a kind of a green neutral. All right, so they are neutralizing each other, but they're also really shifting in identity because the blue and the yellow are interacting to make a greenish, right? Not the same, of course, as if we mix straight yellow into that blue and we know we would get a green. This is the complementary mixture of those two. It heads a bit more toward the yellow side, so you would maybe want to experiment with what happens if you add more blue to it than the orange, to see how just a bit of a complement will change the identity of that blue. And so here you're seeing that the blue still remains blue, but it has a very different feeling than the blue that hasn't been desaturated by the orange. And likewise, you could see how mixing orange with just a little bit of its complement can retain its orange identity, but feel not only darker, but toned down quite a bit. So these are toward the orange, toward the blue, and sort of a middle mixture between the two. When you take this middle mixture and add if you're looking at this, you might want to add a bit more blue or a bit more orange. I'm going to call this one just neutral for the moment and add a little bit of white to that. Then you're also going to see what type of chromatic gray you get from mixing the two. So when we mix two complementary colors together, it makes a neutral or a chromatic gray. And when we add white to that chromatic gray or neutral, we start to see these different kind of color identities. So important when you're painting things that you can't quite identify what type of gray it is. You're thinking about which complementary pairing you might start with to get that particular neutral or gray. So here's an ultramarine blue, and I'll go over and choose a alizarin crimson cadmium yellow to put next to it. So you see this is a different kind of complementary pairing. And maybe we'll just add a little bit of the ultramarine blue to show how that shifts that particular orange into a very interesting muted type of orange. And you wouldn't necessarily look at this color, even this one, and say orange, right? But it is in the orange family, and when we desaturate it, if we wanted to make that color darker and less bright, we add its complement. And we could add any of these complements. We could add cerulean blue to that if we wanted it to be slightly greener and not much darker. We could add the cobalt and cerulean mixture as well. And so we will then head one here to perhaps a more neutral version. Hard to say yet. So if we're looking at this color, maybe we're seeing it as slightly more toward the blue. And I'm going to mix a for sure bluer version to compare with that. So I still had some of that orange on there, and this would be the desaturated with orange ultramarine blue. Okay. And then we want to just check out and see what white's doing with these. And we'll take it to this one, and you can see the gray, the chromatic neutral gray that you get from mixing the alizarin crimson, cadmium yellow, orange with the ultramarine blue. And you get a very sort of neutralized, what you might think of as gray. Some might see it warm, some might see it slightly cooler. In contrast with this, we definitely see this as a warmer and this as a cooler. Some might start to see a little violet in these mixtures. And so this is how you're going to begin mixing these colors, just like the other one. You want to get a nice palette of neutrals mixed between these, starting to understand what the colors do to each other, for each other, when they're mixed together. So with the cadmium red, orange, and ultramarine blue, let's see if there's much of a difference between the cadmium orange and the alizarin orange when we mix these two together. And we may see even more of a violet coming forward in this mixture because this is such a red orange. And you just notice that. If it had more yellow, or if we wanted it to neutralize more, we might add more of the yellow orange to it and see how that shifts that away from the violet. And then we could add a little bit of white to that and see this particular chromatic gray, which definitely still reads to my eye as violet-ish because we started with such a red orange. Okay, so you can see that you're going to get all different variations of neutrals here, from the greenish to the more violet to the more neutral versions of things here. And you can just play with these mixtures. So cerulean blue mixed with alizarin crimson and cadmium yellow mixture. And what this does. And you can mix as many of these, or just maybe 3 combinations as you like. What I would like for you to do is to be able to see what it is to get a sort of a neutral, and also something that you might think of as heading toward a blackish, since we will be interpreting that black. So again, you can sort of see what a cerulean blue does to the alizarin crimson, and maybe how that interacts with white, and how this has an even a totally different type of color identity than the other chromatic grays. Again, these are all colors that then once you get, say you were trying to mix some sort of chromatic gray, some sort of a neutral that feels like the family of the other colors, but it's feeling a little bit, you want it to be cooler. Well, you can head straight back to your blue and mix blue back into it. Or if you wanted it to be warmer, you could try and mix some of the orange into it. So let's just, for the sake of, I want to make it cooler, but not too much darker and not too much cooler. Maybe I take my cerulean blue and see how that shifts the color. Okay, and if you are like, yeah, that's kind of it, but I want to split this in half and see what it's like if it gets a little warmer, and you add your yellow orange to that. And so this is when you start dealing with temperature on a very subtle level, and in some ways back to what we were looking at when we were interpreting those whites with light. So if a warm light is hitting something and making it slightly warmer, but it's still neutral, these are the realms you're going to be in, right? So that's the beginning of warm, cool, of manipulating this palette. Make up quite a few of your oranges, see how they work. Notice if you've got two that feel a little too the same, maybe you want to make that a little redder, or maybe this is too red and you want to make a little bit more orange. It doesn't have to be exactly like mine, but the premise being that you have your alizarin crimson and yellow mixtures here. You have your cadmium red and yellow mixtures here. And you have your ultramarine blue and your cerulean blue, and then the mixture between the two here. And these are your tints. And then these are your desaturated mixtures, chromatic grays. Okay, so these are desaturations. And these are complements, right? So that's this little tutorial. I hope you sped through it. I hope it makes more sense even now, having worked with your red and green. You have this beautiful palette to start painting with. Again, if you need to kind of move some of this out to make room and organize it on the outside of another piece of paper, you can do that, or you can work with this until it gets crazy. Some people even can fold over and use the back side of something if they just need a small portion. But don't worry about that too much. All right, hope this is helpful, and we'll move on to the next part of the project.